Hi, everyone. I think we're mostly here, so I want to get started and so you can get out in this beautiful day. My name is Tara Bradley Steck, and I'm the Directing Fellow of the Institute for Ethics and Integrity in Journalism here at Duquesne. Two of the remaining three fellows in our group are here today, and you may all have taken a class or two from Dr. Pamela Walck. She's back there. Hi, Pam. And Paula Ward. And then our fourth fellow is Lynn Hayes Freeland. Many of you have heard her on TV or radio. She's the fourth on our team, and she's in Atlanta today. So the Institute is young but enthusiastic. We're dedicated to supporting and amplifying the profound need for news gathering and writing that values accuracy, impartiality, transparency, accountability, responsibility, and respect. Indeed, I'd argue that if the news outlets you turn to do not espouse these beliefs, they're not reliable news sources, but rather simple or even nefarious rumor mongers designed to persuade but not inform. One part of the Institute's mission is to support local and national journalism that follows these principles. A second part of our mission is to recognize outstanding journalism practitioners, which we actually are doing next month when we present our inaugural award to Yamiche Alcindor, a correspondent for NBC. A third part of our mission is to offer enhanced educational and professional learning experiences for Duquesne students. And to that end, we occasionally call upon noted journalists to hike up the bluff to talk to the campus community and the general public. Today, you will hear the thoughts of the man who has co-authored the book many of you are reading in some of your classes. The Elements of Journalism, What Newspeople Should Know and the Public Should Expect, co-authored with Bill Kovach, is one of 7 books Tom Rosenstiel has written about journalism, politics, and ethics. It has been translated into more than 25 languages and is used widely in journalism education worldwide. The New York Times calls it a modern classic, while the Wall Street Journal says it's one of the 5 best books ever written on journalism. Tom also has authored 4 novels. During his lengthy journalism career, Tom worked as media writer for the Los Angeles Times, chief congressional correspondent for Newsweek, press critic for MSNBC, business editor of the Peninsula Times Tribune, and a reporter for Jack Anderson's Washington Merry-Go-Round column. I feel so not good. Anyway, this year he was named the Eleanor Merrill Visiting Professor on the Future of News at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. Before that, he spent 9 years as executive director of the American Press Institute and 16 years as director of the Project for Excellence in Journalism, one of the 5 original projects of the Pew Research Center in Washington. The SPJ folks here, please visit their table in the back of the room, will appreciate the fact that he's won 4 medals for journalism research from the Society of Professional Journalists. There's much more to Tom, but I fear we'll never get to hear him speak if I continue to recite the rest of his accomplishments. Suffice it to say, he knows what he's talking about. And so please welcome Tom Rosenstiel.
Suffice it to say, I used to be a redhead and now I'm a white hair guy. Okay, I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes. These slides are going to go by fast, and I hope that there are a lot of questions afterwards. Basically, every generation invents its own journalism. That may surprise you. You may think journalism was the same way for the whole 20th century and now it's been disrupted. It's not the case. We are living in one of those moments for a lot of reasons, not just technology. During the pandemic, there was a racial reckoning in newsrooms over default culture and racism. Implicit in that reckoning were some fundamental questions. I'm going to have to read them because I can't remember them. What are the responsibilities of journalism, and are those responsibilities changing? Professional journalism rose out of the Enlightenment. It did not exist before the idea that people could govern themselves. When the monarchs ruled, there didn't need to be a public opinion. The public didn't need to think about or know much about public affairs. Journalism exists in history and is enshrined in our Constitution so that people can self-govern. You cannot separate journalism from democracy. the more journalism societies have, the more democratic they tend to be. And if you want to run an authoritarian country, you need to seize control of the media. To earn and keep those protections, journalists came to believe historically that they needed to basically do three things. And this doesn't come from journalism scholarship, this came out of the market. They need to provide people with accurate information that over time becomes more accurate and gets closer to the truth. And by the way, even lousy newspapers used to say, we get the facts right and we get close to the truth. They would sensationalize like hell, but they claimed to be super accurate. Maintain fidelity to fact and loyalty, above all, to the public. Journalists will tell you all over the place, yeah, I work for that guy, but I really work for you, and if he does the wrong thing, I'm going to rebel. And there have been lots of rebellions in newsrooms as journalists felt that their publisher, their boss, wasn't aligning with the mission. And the third one was journalism works best. You can do these first two things if you remain independent of faction. That the things you say are not the talking points from the party. Even if you are a liberal journalist, a point of view journalist, the thoughts are your own. In this moment, I don't think those three big responsibilities have changed. But how we fulfill them, how do we live up to the idea of accuracy, of independence, and whatever the third one was, verification, how do we live up to them has had to change dramatically. In the 20th century, journalists called themselves gatekeepers. We decided what the public should know. That really involved many different roles. We weren't just gatekeepers. We were detectives and teachers and watchdogs and witness bearers. That's what those pictures are supposed to represent. But today, that gatekeeper metaphor doesn't really work, right? The fence is, we may be standing at the gate, but there's no fence anywhere, and the rumor cows are roaming the range. Amid live streaming and camera phones, there's a typo, it should be camera phones, politicians tweeting, foreign governments meddling in our elections, misinformation, QAnon, how do journalists do those three things? We need a new understanding of how to practice journalism to live up to those basic fundamentals. Instead of gatekeepers, journalists are often annotators. Instead of gatekeepers of what you don't know, often I'm an annotator as a journalist of what you've already heard about. I'm a verifier of rumors, of conflicting information. Should I believe that thing I heard? Sense makers who add context to the things that you have a few facts, I'm adding more so you can understand them better for yourself. A witness bearer. Somebody has to go to that city council meeting because not everybody else can go there. Collaborators. This is one that journalists would not have thought about a few years ago. But if you're shooting camera phone video from 5 different places in town about the protest, I need to triangulate that. I'm now collaborating with you as a member of the community. I'm not just lecturing you. Convening. Let's get together and talk about this. How should the city, where should we put the new highway? Or should we be banning books in school? Maybe the news organization is gathering an event about that. The list goes on. If I were teaching a class here, fortunately I'm not, you don't have to suffer through that, we could make a long list. News today is a form of collaborative intelligence. What I mean by that is that citizens, the people formerly known as the audience, can be in many places and bring their experience, their expertise, what's going on, what's happening right now. 100 cameras from citizens, way better than the one camera from the TV station. Machines, algorithms, computers can count and process data, but journalists can do things in this collaboration that other people can't. We can triangulate all the intelligence from these other places. we have access to actually ask the president or the mayor stuff, which would be hard for the average person to do. And hopefully we have some skills at telling stories. So we're not threatened by citizen collaboration. We're enhanced by it. Okay, so where does all that, we're doing this job, we're getting facts, we're doing it differently than we used to. What about that last thing, about being independent? Especially when the audience today, and your generation in particular, has spent a lot of time growing up among a new kind of partisan media, especially national media, cable, where these folks are not so independent. What's the future of journalistic independence? Well, that brings us to the big question, the one that journalists screw up on all the time: objectivity. What is it? What's it mean? Where did the idea come from? First, let me clarify some misconceptions about objectivity. It did not come from marketers and anchormen or lawyers. These are all things I've heard, right? There was no idea of objectivity. It was lawyers who said that journalists should be objective, and that way people wouldn't sue us, or it would be good, for our marketing. Actually, the idea of objectivity came from people who were worried around 100 years ago that journalism was failing, and they were trying to figure out a way for journalism to get closer to the truth. Before there was objectivity in journalism, journalists talked about realism. And what that meant was put in a lot of facts, make it seem more real than, and the more details you have, the more true it will be, or the more true it will seem. But there began to be questions about that. And it was a moment a lot like this, when there were doubts about whether democracy could survive. Right after World War I, monarchy were falling all over the world. It was unclear what would replace them. Marxism was rising. The Russian Revolution had just happened, and fascism was emerging. Democracy was in doubt, and the Germans were beginning to play with the idea of propaganda and information control as a new science. Thoughtful people believed that journalism needed to be better than what Walter Lippmann at the time called an accidental witness. One big thing, he and a colleague did a huge study that they published in the Atlantic magazine of the New York Times coverage of the Russian Revolution. And they talked about this thing that they called unconscious bias in the coverage of the Times. If you read, not that you should, the 42-page piece in the Atlantic they published, it doesn't use the word default culture, but it's talking about default culture. It was the 1920s. It was not a naive time. It was a time when we were becoming aware of human subjectivity and the unconscious mind. That was a painting from the 1920s by Picasso. Critics brought the idea of objectivity from science and social science into journalism to provide something more rigorous than realism. Because of a growing recognition that journalists themselves could never be objective, the idea was they should adopt methods of gathering the news that were more objective. Objectivity as a method, not objectivity as a consciousness. When Lippmann talked about this in a book called Liberty in the News, he said, we need to bring a more scientific spirit to the gathering of news. Unity of method rather than unity of aim, okay? He said that journalists would confuse their good intentions about telling the truth and think that, well, I'm trying to be fair, therefore I'm fair. And you say, no. You need a method to ensure that you're going to be fair because, in fact, you're a human being and you're not going to be fair. And he called on journalism to aspire to a common intellectual method and common area of fact. I almost fell off the stage just now. So replace the word objectivity in your mind with the word transparency, and you get actually closer to what Lippmann was talking about. That's a more modern term. When I first wrote the book, The Elements of Journalism, in 2001, a long time ago, a lot of you weren't alive yet, we used the word transparency a lot, and journalists would call me up and say, what what is that? Like, how do you do that? That's bogus. What, am I supposed to put footnotes in my newspaper story? This idea of objectivity as a method very quickly got confused. There were a lot of reasons. There's deep-seated anti-intellectualism in journalism. The apprenticeship model of, like, I'm going to teach you how to be a journalist by just having you do what I do, and I'm, like, not in the theory, just do what I do. It's how we teach it. That's how I learned it, even in graduate school. Failure to teach methods that are used in other social sciences, like anthropology, ethnography, quantitative methods. We could bring all that into journalism education, but we haven't. Not much, unless you happen to have a good professor who did it, him or herself. And lots of debates about postmodernist arguments in other fields. And a lot of fear of theory of people like me. Journalists themselves are to blame for the confusion that objectivity is neutrality. We lacked rigor in our teaching. It was easier to teach young journalists to, like, just be neutral. Don't take sides. Keep yourself out of it. And our own ignorance of the default cultures that existed in our newsrooms. But objectivity as method lives in the work of the best journalists. They might not even think about it this way. If you watch a documentary at Frontline, it ain't neutral, but it is deeply verified. In the New Yorker and other magazines, the writers come to a point of view, and the highest compliment you can pay a journalist is to say, you know, I really like that article. I disagree with your conclusions. Why? Because you accepted the reporting, you saw what they did was valid, you learned something, and you also recognized where the author was moving into their conclusions. They weren't stacking the deck like a manipulative documentary where you don't know what's true because the whole thing is just marshaled to be an argument. There's a real difference between journalism of opinion or interpretive journalism, explanatory journalism, where you can see the reporting and also see the conclusions and how they're separated. Doubts about objectivity as neutrality existed almost immediately. A movement came in the 20s. By the early 30s, people were saying, nobody's objective, this is bullshit. And that question gained new force in 2020, as particularly journalists of color said, and my friend Wes Lowery in particular in a column, influential column in the New York Times, talking about what he called objective neutrality. Jay Rosen, who's a journalism professor, pretty famous, has popularized the term the view from nowhere, saying that journalists have this view from nowhere, which is obviously a delusion, because everybody's subjective and brings subjectivity to their work. Well, Jay actually took that term, that view from nowhere, from this book of philosophy by another NYU professor, a guy named Tom Nagel. And Nagel's book and his use of the term, the view from nowhere, is actually one of the most eloquent defenses of objectivity as method ever written. So Jay flipped the meaning of the view from nowhere completely on its head from what Nagel meant. For Nagel, objectivity is a method of understanding the world. In other words, it's a method, not a consciousness, blah, blah, blah. Now, the guy's a philosopher, and this book is heavy going, and I'm not recommending that you buy this book. I'm here to, I read it, so you don't have to. Nagel writes, to acquire a more objective understanding of some aspect of life or the world, we step back from our initial view of that aspect of the life or the world, and form a new conception which has that view and its relation to the world as its object. Okay, the guy's an academic, it puts me to sleep too, but look at it again. To acquire a more objective understanding of some aspect of the life of the world, we, quote, step back from our initial view and form a new conception which contains our initial view and puts it in relation to the views of others. In other words, you don't deny you're subjective. In the objective method, the first thing you do is identify where do I stand on this? And how do I use that and move beyond my initial reaction to something? So in Nagel's thinking, you become conscious of your initial view and the default culture in which you're operating. So the first thing you do is say, okay, who around here disagrees with me? And if everybody in this room, in this newsroom, thinks the same way, we got a problem. I need to go out and talk to people who see the world differently. We just had an election. I think we might have had some default culture going on. Thus, personal identity, rather than something you deny, is something that informs the objective method. Okay, you've decided what your initial view is. Okay, the way I see this, now that's got its limitations. How do I move beyond that? We then go out and engage in open-minded inquiry. That's a term I like a lot, open-minded inquiry. Reporting without an agenda, to put what we and others think in relation to the world. Journalism as open-minded inquiry means you go out and you find out what happened, the thing itself. You verify whether those facts that you got are facts. You put those facts in context. You put other facts around them, including how other people view them or how other people understand them. Then you go out and you get more facts. And you correct what you got wrong the first time. And you identify new questions based on the new facts. So you're going further and further. You haven't denied that you've got a bias. You're just trying to get beyond where you started. In other words, starting with your initial view and your personal identity are key to asking better questions. How do we know what happened? What do we know what happened? What is not known? What do I not understand? This is both a repertorial and a cultural question. Like, I'm an aging white guy reporting on something about younger people. Like, what do I not get here that I need to understand? Critical to begin with where you are. What will different audiences not understand? How do I empathize with people who don't think the way I do when I'm reporting this and when I'm writing it? How will other people who are not like me see this? So good reporting starts in dialogue with yourself and your colleagues to diversify your thinking. It does not start with thinking, I'm neutral. One's own initial subjective thoughts, feelings, and experience are integral to making inquiry authentically human, helping us identify unconscious bias and form hypotheses. They are where inquiry begins, not where it ends. Okay, so those who think that objectivity means neutrality or a lack of consciousness, they're being unfair to the idea that objectivity is a process. Like, they don't get that. They think, I'm neutral, therefore I'm fair, I'm good, we're good. And objectivity of method, of gathering and weighting and understanding evidence, does not mean both-sidism. Has anybody here not know, or raise your hand if you know the term both-sidism, if you've heard that term. Both-sidism is, okay, I'm going to quote both sides equally, and therefore I'm being safe. Well, what if one side is telling just a bunch of lies? Both-sidism can then be a distortion of the truth. What if both-sidism was a big thing in the early days of climate change, where climate deniers would prop up these kind of fake institutes saying that the climate was not changing? And for 10 years, the press was quoting these climate deniers almost equally in their stories, even though the science was overwhelmingly on the side that the climate was warming. That was a classic case of both-sidism. Political stenography. Republicans say this, Democrats say that, and these guys say this. I'm going to quote them all. I have no point of view. I'm not going to evaluate the veracity of any of this. That's political stenography. False equivalency. The Democrats, the Republicans got this problem, but the Democrats got a problem too, and here it is. If these problems are not equal morally, that's a distortion. And denial of self. Like, I have no point of view. I'm not biased. I'm just going out and gathering the news. Another form of bad method. And nor does it mean that after you've done enough reporting that you can't form a point of view. At the same time, we see a lot of people who hide behind a neutral voice. You see this on cable, on a lot of different cable channels, where the journalists, like, I'm just asking questions. One of the things you'll see in terms of bias, particularly if you look at cable, is it's the story choice that involves bias. Not the way the story itself is reported, but the choice of the story in the first place. Like, how bad is this for Biden? Well, if that's the story frame, you can report the story pretty neutrally. Just interview people, but you're asking a question that's loaded in the first place. And vice versa on MSNBC, honestly. So let's put some of this into more, let's get out of the world of philosophy and put it into journalistic terms. What Nagel means is that to get closer to the truth, we need to widen our lens and recognize that this, which you can't see very well because it's not dark enough, could be taken from that picture. Notice the girl in the red shirt in the first picture is in a crowd. Or what looks like this, the Capitol's on fire. Could be from another angle, this. And another angle, same fire, this. And actually it's this. These pictures were all taken at the same time in DC and were first reported on local TV news as the Capitol on fire. But widen your lens enough and you get to a different point of view. So what would Nagel's objective method look like if you were a journalist? Imagine you're interviewing a white supremacist, and instead of saying, hi, I'm here from the New York Times, and I want to interview you, what if you said, hey, I'm a white, liberal, LGBTQ woman. I disagree with everything you say. Help me understand why you say it. This is something that actually a young reporter who was very good at covering neo-Nazis did. She always acknowledged who she was. And then they actually treated her very differently than because she wasn't pretending to have no point of view. Or my friend Paul Taylor, who was a good reporter before he joined me and became a dorky think tank guy. Before doing his reporting, whenever he was going out on a story that was more than just a daily, he would write down in a note for himself what he thought the story was going to be. And after a couple of days of reporting, when he thought he was done, he would check out what he had written down as his hypothesis. And if it hadn't changed, if he hadn't learned anything, then he thought, I didn't do a very good job of reporting. I need to go do more because I just ended up where I started. I didn't learn anything. So I don't like the word objectivity. I read these books that defend it and blah, 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 because I'm stuck with it, but I don't like it. Because it invites people to think what Jay Rosen thinks. I mean, Jay's a friend of mine, but journalists always start someplace. We don't have a view from nowhere. We stand for factualism. We stand for empiricism. We believe in government transparency. We believe in equality under the law. Racial justice, looking out for the voiceless. I could make a list of 15 things that I would say as a journalist is where I stand, and I would defend them as very positive biases. And those are informed by my personal experience, by my age, my gender, my ethnicity, my religion, such as it is, or my ignorance of my religion. The biases that hurt us as journalists, or in any endeavor of inquiry, are the ones that we don't acknowledge because we don't see them. We don't see them coming. So what's a better term for objectivity of method? Wes Lowry, in his column from 2020, said, journalists should think about moral clarity rather than objectivity. And all these people who are friends of mine said, you have to, he cited my book in his column. All my friends said, you have to write something, you have to write something, because this is not a good term. And I agree. I don't like the term moral clarity as a substitute for objectivity. Why? Well, the Proud Boys have moral clarity. Nazis have moral clarity. I think the more that we actually come to understand things, the more complex they become, and often less clear. And we are capable of understanding the tensions within them. But complexity and clarity often don't go together. The closer you get to understanding, the more you appreciate complexity. Genuine inquiry requires humility, not clarity, humility. An ideology, to me, is a theory about how the world works, but reality rarely neatly fits ideology. Okay, so I've done this exercise, like with editors of the New York Times. What would we call it if we didn't call it objectivity of method? Here are different terms that people have come up with. Rounded inquiry, passionate, open-minded, independent inquiry. That's a lot of words. Fully dimensional reporting. An editor at the New York Times came up with that one. Moral curiosity rather than clarity. Skeptical way of knowing. Comprehensive reporting. Genuine inquiry. Open-minded inquiry. Again, if you were in my class, I'd make you make a list, and we'd have to write them down. But we need a term, we need at least an understanding of this as a method. One that doesn't justify ending up with where we already were. Journalism is a form of truth-telling, but it is not a form of just telling my personal truth. In fact, it requires the obligation of going out and understanding the truths of other people to create a public square that is not necessarily neutral, but where people can form understandings of each other. Otherwise, you're in the propaganda business. You're in the persuasion business, not the understanding business. So what do we owe the public? I must be getting near the end because this is where I started. I think we owe the public a public square with a continuing search for new facts. Like what happened in this election? I don't think the press knew beforehand. I'm not sure they know now. They need to go further and beyond just a couple of polls. They need to put those facts in context. I'm not sure how much we need from more opinion these days. A recognition that the media is not hypodermic. What do I mean by that? So 50, 60, 70 years of media research has basically proven one thing. The media do not tell people what to think. They tell them what to think about. In other words, you tell me a story. If I disagree with the story, I'm going to disagree with it. But you're making me think about that subject. So the media has an agenda-setting power. That's its primary effect. But it's not like you said it and it went in like a drug into my system, like a hypodermic drug, and that's now what I think. It's just not how it works. Took media scholars 70 years to figure that out. And we owe people verification and humility and open-mindedness and verification. More verification, more verification. Because we might be wrong because of our biases. Okay, so each generation creates its own journalism. Thanks to your generation, I believe we will have a clearer sense of the evils of default culture and unconscious bias in journalism. I think you will invent a better journalism than I grew up with. This is a magnificent time to be thinking about becoming a journalist. The economic model is not clear, but when I went to journalism school, all we tried to do was figure out how to put our feet in the snow prints of the people who came before us. The idea that we would invent something, that we would create a better journalism, it never occurred to us. We just wanted to get a job like one of our heroes. We never thought about the limitations of those heroes. But I hope that independent verification will be part of it. Thank you. I'm done. See, I told you 90 slides would be 30 minutes. I would love if we had questions, any kind of questions, because that, for me, is the best part of this. I knew what I was going to say, but I don't know what you're going to say. Somebody's got to have a question. Break the ice. Yes? That's a great question. How did I get interested in journalism? Well, so I was going to be, I was in high school, I got the bug pretty early, but it came unexpectedly. So after 1 year of high school, near my end of my freshman year, my school guidance counselor said, here's what's going to happen. Here's your path. You're going to do this, take these classes, this, and then you're going to go to this college. And I was like, and so I said, what's the name of that busing experiment, that other school that's 100% black? I want to go there now because I don't want to be on this path that you've already decided for me. So I went to this school that was part of a busing experiment. This is the 1971, a long time ago. And my first week at the school, a senior walked up to me. A senior, and I was a sophomore. So this is a very intellectual story. And said, you should work for the school newspaper. I didn't know that a senior knew who I was. He came from my home school. That guy, that senior, later became Bill Clinton's press secretary. His name is Mike McCurry. But I got swept up in the high school newspaper at this school that was part of a political maelstrom, because in between the time I told my guidance counselor I want to go to that school, what's the name of it? They had a school board election, and now the school board was opposed to this busing experiment. So we were caught in the middle of it, and the school board tried to fire the advisor to our school newspaper because she said, I'm going to let the kids write whatever they want and not do any censorship. And it's like, wow, there's something going on here. So that's how it happened, and there was just something about telling stories to people, even just telling stories to like my friends. Like I went to this school board meeting. You can't believe what happened, and just seeing them react to me telling a story. Actually, telling them the story in person, probably even more so than writing it down and not knowing how they reacted to it. So that's how it happened. And then all through college and stuff, I was like, maybe I shouldn't be a journalist. Maybe I should be a jazz musician or something like whatever. And but I kept coming back to it because one of the great virtues of it. Somebody asked me this the other day. One of the great virtues of it is you just get to tell people the truth, including your effing bosses. So there are a lot of people in newsrooms. There are different styles of people, lots of different personalities, but they have one thing in common, which is they tend to dislike authority of all kinds, and they're congenitally unable to not tell the truth about stuff. So it's an okay atmosphere to work in. Other questions? Yes. Yes. We'll get to you, but you're two students first.
Was there an exciting incident that you or your co-author Bill saw that motivated you to write the elements of journalism?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what was going on in, this was like the late 90s, right? And journalism was being disrupted, not by the internet. The internet hadn't happened yet, but it was being disrupted by cable. For you guys, this just doesn't seem like such a big deal. But can you imagine if there were 4 TV channels and all of a sudden there were 400? When I was a kid, 70% of the TV stations, 70% of the televisions that were on at 6:30 at night were tuned to one of the 3 network newscasts. 70% of people were watching these 3 newscasts that were identical to each other, okay? So cable comes in, and all of a sudden, like, there's everything. And the government deregulates broadcasting. So there used to be rules that, like, if you broadcast one point of view on your TV channel or your radio station, you have to have the alternative points of view. Something called the fairness doctrine, the equal time rule. Well, they got rid of that in the 80s. As cable was coming in, because they said, well, you don't need these rules now because we're going to have so many different outlets. So talk radio happened, and infotainment, that wasn't even a term in the 1980s. So Access Hollywood and all that kind of stuff, and and journalists said, well, wow, we have to get more infotainy. And so journalism got a lot less serious. And the nightly news, you know, the OJ trial, there was this kind of moment like the OJification of journalism, where like people, because OJ was like, the OJ story was like, it was like a breakout hit that jumped from R&B to pop to gospel to like it just was, it was #1 on every chart. And so the media, which was seeing its ratings decline as you know, because of the structural expansion of media, they kept looking for the next breakout hit. So they were sensational. There was a lot of sensationalization going on. It was kind of this era of new sensationalism and infotainment in serious media. And these weird crime, sex scandal stories like John Benet Ramsey, who was a little girl who was put in kid modeling shows, beauty pageants. She got murdered. Man, that was like the story on nightly news for like 6 months. It's like, okay, they're overdoing this. So there was a lot of hand-wringing among journalists. And you know, the emergence of talk radio, the emergence of Fox News, neo-partisanship. So that's what we're trying to figure out. Just because something's on television doesn't mean it's journalism. Publishing and journalism are not the same thing. So what's journalism? Before, when you had this very limited media landscape, journalism was so homogenous. The 3 network newscasts were all the same. Local newscasts all over the country were very similar to each other. They were a little more tawdry than national news, but they were very similar. It was very homogenized. And all of a sudden it wasn't. And it was a free-for-all. It was the Wild West. And this was pre-internet. And we thought, okay, so what, if publishing isn't journalism, so what's journalism? And what are the responsibilities of journalists? What should they do? So the idea that there was like a theory, that journalism had an implicit theory, and it was these things, and you could say these are the core principles, that, you know, that was pretty new. Some people said to us, in fact, a very prominent editor, a guy named John Siegenthaler, was the editor of the Nashville Tennessean, and then the First Opinion page editor of the USA Today, said, you don't need to write these things down. Everybody knows this stuff. And we thought, oh, shoot, okay, well, I guess we shouldn't do it, but we already got a book contract, so we'll do it anyway. You know, and here we are 20-something years later, and people are actually, it seems even more relevant to people in some ways now. Like, how do I classify, you know, Alex Jones? You know, what is that? He says he's news. Is he news? Why isn't he news? Project Veritas, is that news? They stage these things to embarrass liberals, but it's true. So is it journalism? They say they're journalism. They go into court and say we're just journalists. Are they journalists? That's how it happened, and that's why people still actually want to hear me say some things from time to time. Let me call Elon Musk. I've got his number here. Because he's going to say that, you know, what does he say? He's a First Amendment absolutist. But that was before advertisers got mad at him. One of the interesting things about social media is that the people who use it most are the most distrustful of it. So your generation, people under, well, Gen Z and Gen X and millennials, actually Gen X is, I guess, they're wrong. They're like too old. But millennials and Gen Z, and the younger you get in Gen Z, the more they are skeptical, according to survey data, of what they see in social media. Because they are, like, they grew up there, they know it, it's the Wild West. You have more skills at navigating it. It's also depressing you, according to the data. And your generation are looking for ways to limit your time there, and you say you feel manipulated by social media. And you wish the algorithms wouldn't, but like my students, they say, like, I'm on TikTok a lot, all day. I wish I weren't, but it's like, I wish I didn't eat so much sweet food, but I do. Or I wish I didn't watch so much TV, but it's so easy. I don't know what's going to happen, but I will say this, which isn't exactly your question. When I was at Pew, we studied the emergence of Facebook and Twitter. We were testing whether what people said in social media matched what people said in surveys. Okay, well, surveys were better back then. They weren't quite as troubled with technology as they are now. So we had pretty good data at that point. This is 15 years ago. And what we found was that people on social media tend to be bipolar in the sense that they speak out when they're really happy about something or they're really pissed off about something. And what the platforms define as meaningful engagement encourages that. Liking and sharing. You don't tend to share something if you say, you read something and go, I don't know what I think about that. If I see something more about that, I think I'll read it. I'll read the next thing. Because what gets shares that pick up other shares and other likes are things where other people already feel strongly, right? So there's this performative aspect to what people will like and share in social media, because it's not all that exciting to share something or like something and have no one respond. You're kind of shouting in the dark here. So what people respond to are things that they will reliably get another response, and those are things that people already feel strongly about. So if I say liberals are, snowflakes, and I've got a lot of conservative followers, that will get a lot of response. Or if I say Trump is, a lunatic, and I'm a liberal, that will get a lot of responses. But if I say, this is an interesting article that's 4,000 words, I think you should read it, I don't get a lot of responses. So I don't do that, because it's deflating. Any other questions? I could do this thing, if there are no questions, where I could ask you questions. So, how many of you sleep with one of these in your bedroom? Raise your hand if the answer is yes. Okay. There's a couple of people who have self-control, but you're an extreme minority. How many of you look at this before you actually get vertical in the morning? You're still in bed and you look at it. Raise your hand. Okay, what do you look at? What do you look at? Okay, text messages, email, and social media. Who else goes on social media? While still wind down, yeah. What do you look at? Oh, Instagram. And what do you follow on Instagram? Okay. Wow, you're very healthy. Let's find somebody else. Who else looks at social media in the morning before you've even gotten out of bed? Yeah, what do you look at? Sports. Twitter. Pretty much just sports, or is there some like politics and news, other news slipping in there? Yeah, okay. Good mental health. Anybody else? Who else is on social media in the morning before you get out of bed? What do you see? Okay. All right. Now it's mid-morning. Have you looked at your phone again? How many people have looked at their phone again before lunchtime? Pretty much everybody. Same mix, social media, texts. Okay. You're in a coffee shop, in line. Are you looking at your phone? How many of you are looking at your phone if you're in line, waiting? All right. I could go on and on and on. How many of people look at your phone before now you're getting into bed? It's late. How many of you look at your phone right before you go to bed? Okay. So just a couple of implications for this. First of all, when news used to be consumed 3 times a day, in the morning newspaper or the morning news, like the Today Show, the dinner hour, which was when the nightly news was on, and the early local news, and then right before bed, what they called late local news, which is at 11 o'clock after prime time. That was another thing we used to talk about, prime time. I don't know, they don't have that anymore. When people consume news that way, those were in basically what I would call news sessions. They were about 15 to 30 minutes long. You'd flip through the newspaper. If you were watching the morning news, like the Today Show, they had 15-minute cycles. They would recycle the news in 15 minutes. Weather would come up again at 15 minutes, traffic, weather, news. And by the way, at 7:45, they assumed that the men had left and had gone to work, so the programming became more female-oriented for the last hour and a half of the Today and the morning news. And you consume news under the umbrella of a brand, right? I'm watching the CBS Evening News, and so CBS News says CBS News has learned. And I basically can trust what I'm consuming because I'm under the umbrella of that brand. And if I'm reading the morning newspaper, everything is coming to me from that paper. And if I read an afternoon paper, which was pretty much going out of business by the 80s, same thing. So we consume the news under a brand. In the way you consume news, and that I consume news, because I was raising my hand too, the news has been atomized. What I mean by that is I'm no longer reading it under brand. I'm in Instagram, and the first thing I notice, the data show, is who shared it, not who it came from. And this may not be true for you, but for the majority of people, the most influential factor in terms of whether you believe or trust what you read is who shared it, not who produced it. So the news has been atomized, and the atomic unit now is the story and the sharer, no longer the brand. So for journalists, this has huge implications. One thing that it means is that I can't just say CBS News has learned, because the consumer might not even notice that it's coming from CBS. Why I should believe that story needs to be in that story. So you'll see stories that say today, this story is based on 14 interviews with people from the West Wing. We granted them anonymity because of this, that, and the other thing. There's all this explanation, which is a good thing. It's transparency about why I should trust this. And also, the news and opinion is all mixed together, right? Even on my phone, if I'm on the Washington Post website, I'll click through a couple of stories, and the next thing I know, I've got opinion stories coming up in my stream because I was looking at political stories, and the algorithm is saying, oh, this person's looking at political stories. So all of a sudden, I'm in the opinion section of the Washington Post without my even knowing it. So opinion and news is all mixed up together. We don't do a very good job of labeling those differences, but there are some papers that are sticking the word opinion in the headline so that once a story moves into social media, it's the fact that it's no longer news, but it is something else, is inextricably linked to the headline. But there's all kinds of implications because of this. The biggest one is, I grew up in what I would call the trust me era of news. Trust me, I'm CBS News. You live today, we all live, in the show me era of news. Show me why I should trust this. And hopefully I'm discriminating enough to know that I should trust it because of what's in the story and not because I really like Q, and Q said this might be true. Yes?
Talk a little about stories that, to that point about sharing and liking and clicks on a story and how that affects what gets covered in the newsroom, what assignments and whether it's a ballot. And again, the entertainment part of it. Was it entertaining enough to be shared and liked?
Yeah. So one thing that's really been wild in the news industry for the last 10 years is the influence of social media and then the lack of influence of social media. 10 years ago, if you went to the Washington Post or the Beaver County Times or the Philly Inquirer or the Post-Gazette, more than half their digital traffic would have come from Facebook. In some cases, it was 70, 80%. And the home page, the front page of their digital presence, was below 20%. And so people thought, okay, and this was a thing, people would say, every page on your website is your home page. And so the key thing is to have related links so that if people are reading a story that they come to in social media and they click on it, and they do more than look at the headline, they actually click on it, they'll see other content from your. Well, Facebook decided after the 2016 election, this news thing is just causing us terrible headaches. Let's reduce news in the algorithm. And all of a sudden, the amount of traffic coming from Facebook to most news sites fell through the floor. Way below, no longer 80%, way below, more like 20%, because Facebook wanted to get out of the news game. And the traffic to websites then fell, and they had to start figuring out other ways to do things and other ways of reaching people. And by the way, the home page became important again. And all those related links on every page where you had a story, they weren't doing much. Because it turned out that what mattered when people went to, what mattered in terms of whether people became loyal consumers was not how many stories they looked at per visit, but it was how often they came back. And in fact, the most loyal viewers to a publication will probably look at one story at a time, leave, but they might come back 6 or 7 times during the day. But they don't have these long news sessions anymore. For whatever reasons, I find it's true of myself. I'll okay, I got a minute, I'll read this story. Oh man, this is depressing. Now I'm gonna go do something else. Or maybe I just don't have the attention span. But the most important thing is frequency, not depth of visit. And that's a dramatically different view than people had. So social media is less important to these publications, but it may be that you need to create content that is social media within itself. So the Washington Post, I live in DC, the Washington Post has created TikTok, is now producing stories in TikTok because there are people who spend most of their time in TikTok. They're not going to go from TikTok to clicking onto the story from the Washington Post. So it's not. Another thing that is interesting is the most important product. So product in journalism can mean a lot of things. A newsletter is a product. The most important new product that the New York Times has created in the last 10 years was the morning newsletter. And the morning newsletter was not designed to get people to click on stories from in the New York Times. It was designed to get people to think, wow, I just read the New York Times in 2 minutes. That was great. I love that. I'm going to open the thing again tomorrow. Now, you had to give them your email to get the newsletter. So then they suddenly knew who you were, which also meant that they knew who you were on your phone versus your desktop versus your whatever. You became a person and not a unique visitor or a device to them. That was extremely helpful, but what they found was by saving people time with the newsletter, people would open the newsletter more often, and that was a gateway to becoming a subscriber. So the newsletter reduced page views, but increased subscribers. So it's just a way more subtle way. And then, they also said, okay, well, let's create some new products. And one new product was cooking. And another new product, accidentally, were games. People subscribe to the New York Times because they like games, and the kind of people who like games also like the New York Times. So they've recreated the bundle. Social media is the ultimate, chase virality. BuzzFeed was all about chasing virality. The New York Times model now is, let's recreate the bundle, but it's not in one product. It's in a family of products. I like The Athletic. I like Spelling Bee. I like cooking recipes. I'm a New York Times kind of person. And if I subscribe to the thing in one package, it saves me money, even though it's incredibly expensive. So we're going full circle back toward a bundle, like all things, I don't think they've done it in Pittsburgh, but the idea would be all things Pittsburgh for a certain kind of person, hopefully not just ideologically. So one subscription gets me a lot of things that I like, not just news. The Post is moving in that direction. The Times is ahead. The Times is ahead, but yeah, the Boston Globe is getting there. The Minneapolis Star Tribune is getting there. These actually happen to be publications that are owned by billionaires who only own one publication. So they're super invested in that one thing. For the Times to get there, among the things they did, they sold everything else. They had a bunch of newspapers in the South. They sold them. They owned the Boston Globe. They sold it. They forced themselves to think about just this one thing. Now, they subsidize news with games and cooking, but it's all, I'm in the New York Times. I'm under the umbrella again. Right. But when it comes to verifying the actual source, kind of follow the money. Yeah. That's happening so much with pharmaceutical companies in particular. I mean, it's sort of like the tobacco playbook. We'll pay the doctors to say that nicotine's good for you. Right. How are we going, because it turns into, he said, she said, and they're both claiming to be nonpartisan, nonprofit, altruistic organizations, getting to the root of their source, the real source of these sources. Yeah. What do you think about that? So there's a guy at Stanford, an historian at Stanford, who studied Nazi propaganda, and then he studied the tobacco industry. And he said, wow, there's a big difference between the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry in the 60s said, we're going to challenge the science that tobacco is bad for you. We're going to create doubt about it. And they spent 20 years, and they basically delayed the regulation, the anti-tobacco regulation. When he studied them, he said, wow, this is a different kind of propaganda, because the Nazis believed their anti-Semitism. They believed what they were saying. The tobacco industry doesn't. In fact, he unearthed a document in their archives that said, our product is doubt. So, and then the climate industry, I mean the energy industry followed that playbook with climate. So this historian said, you know what, this is a whole industry now. And he gave it a name. He said, I'm going to create an academic discipline around it. And he called it agnotology. So ology in Greek or Latin is like the study of, and agno is ignorance. So it's the study of ignorance. But what he's talking about is the conscious manufacture of ignorance and doubt. And I think it jumped from the tobacco industry to but now I think it permeates our politics. As politicians become more extreme in either direction, one of the ways that they persuade people to vote for them is not to say, embrace my extreme ideas. It is to create doubt. I mean, you might do that in a primary, but in the general election, you have to create doubt about your opponent. So one of the reasons that our politics has become so much more toxic is because essentially they're now engaged in agnotology. The people who love me, but I need to persuade the people who might love the other person or might like the other person, I'm going to make them unacceptable. So that's an expression, actually, that's agnotology coming into our politics as an expression of extremism. I first discovered this when a political consultant who worked for Ollie North. North was running for Senate in Virginia. This is 94, 92, something like that. And the guy, the consultant who I had gotten to know, said, the problem we got is that Ollie North is way too conservative for Virginia. The only way we can win the Senate is by making the other guy seem more unacceptable. Okay, well that was edgy in 92. It's the norm now, right? If you see an ad that is not cartoonishly negative about your opponent, it's like, that's the one that stands out. And the conspiracy theories like QAnon are also part of this. You know, they're saying there's a secret cabal that you don't know about. You're being misled. The fake news is lying to you. It's not so much, the point of fake news is not to actually get you to believe the fake news. It's to get you to doubt all the other news. So the use of doubt has become a critical part of our culture in a way that makes doing journalism extremely difficult, or science, or anything else. I mean, I really think in a lot of ways, the political polarization, and polarization, by the way, what it technically means is how far apart ideologically are the two parties? How polarized are they? It doesn't mean that a state that's 50-50 like Michigan, Wisconsin, it's not a polarized state, it's evenly divided. Polarization means how far apart are the views of the people in the two parties. I think polarization, the fact that people like distrust each other, is an expression of this doubt. Like we've created so much doubt about each other that I don't trust the validity of anything that you say. So I don't know if I exactly answered the question, but I think it's huge. I think in a lot of ways it's the problem. It's like the crux of it. If you decide you're going to be in a fact-based business, you are now in the anti-agnotology business. And you have to figure out a way to erode agnotology. You guys are done in a couple minutes, right? Your class ends at 50? Yeah. Yeah. I like open-minded inquiry. to me, that gets that, because, like, inquiry suggests that I'm trying to find things out, and open-minded suggests that I'm not just trying to persuade you. Like, the big difference between, in this whole question of like, what's journalism and what's not, one of the big differences between journalism and some of these other activities is the point of journalism is to get your audience to think for themselves. It's like, here's a bunch of facts. I'm not telling you what to think about these, but I want you to think about them. Make up your own mind. And I'm trying to provide as much context as I can. Political advocacy is, here's a bunch of facts, and I want you to vote this way. I'm trying to persuade you to a specific outcome. So they're both forms of communication. They're both forms of providing facts even. But I'm not cherry-picking the facts to persuade you. I am actually out there trying to find out what do I think is the most reasonable conclusion. And I'm providing evidence for you. You can disagree with me, or maybe I don't know what my conclusion is. The other thing I would just say about this is, like, where we are in the arc of something matters. Like, with climate change, the press blew it for about 10 years. They don't get it wrong anymore. They don't engage in this both-sidism because that story is well established and we know. And even the energy industry is no longer engaged in climate denialism. Their focus is government intervention is the wrong way to solve it. So they're anti-regulation, but they're no longer trying to, because it's pretty hard to. So I think where we are in the arc of a story, like when charter schools started out, liberals were against them, and the press was pretty skeptical of charter schools because of a kind of strain of liberalism in the press. Once there were more facts, the press became less one-sided in its approach to charter schools. Or you could become more one-sided because the facts become, but I think at the beginning of a story, journalists are more inclined to sort of say, okay, well, this side's saying this side's saying that. And some of those old techniques of balance probably make a little more sense. But as we know more and the evidence is clearer, we need to be true to the facts and not just engaging in equal time. Well, you're the head of the institute, so I think you can do whatever you want.
So your book has been translated in 25 languages. It's used around the world. A lot of what we've been talking about is U.S.-based kind of habits. Do you see a huge difference as you look at journalism in various countries, or are we pretty much all going down the same path of where we use news and get news?
Yeah, so that's a good question. When we wrote this book, we were just thinking about American journalism, and I didn't pretend. I'm no expert on a lot of other places, and we did. All the research we did was, we had no idea that the thing was going to be an international. When Bill was now quite an old man, he went to Indonesia for the publication of the Indonesian version, and it's not the most democratic country. They were like, welcome Bill Kovach, like placards all over the streets about him coming there. And it's like, you just can't believe it. I remember being at a State Department event where an Angolan blogger, this is a guy who's doesn't work for any news organization, just a blogger. He says, as far as I'm concerned, everyone in this room is a soldier in the same army of truth, but we're in different platoons. And what we discovered was that once you're in the business of finding out what happened here, checking your facts, did they say this or did they say that? There is something to that becomes kind of universal. And even though these people are all working in completely different traditions, and some of them are actually working for government-owned publications, and the people who were really interested in verification ended up being really kind of all part of the same religion. And so we did not expect this universality that exists, but it does. There's just something about it. It's like, okay, doctors try and heal, and firefighters try and put out fires, and journalists try and find out what happened. And the equipment might be different, but we're really have a lot more in common than, and I guess, my guess is that congenital anti-authoritarian inability to say anything other than what you really think is true probably is true in newsrooms all over the place. Meaning they're like entertaining and you're going to meet like some really crazy ass people if you go in the news business. People who are essentially unemployable in any other field because of this inability to keep their mouth shut. Thank you for your attention.